All right. Then welcome everybody, and a particularly warm welcome to Professor Arturo Escobar, who's speaking to us tonight from the US. I'm very excited you accepted this invitation. Thanks a lot for your willingness to present and share some of your thoughts with us and to discuss on them with all of us. This lecture series is the SIP lecture series co-organized by the College of Fellows at Tübingen University and the Society for Intercultural Philosophy. And I will write the link to the Society's website in the chat in a minute. So visit our website, and maybe you can consider becoming a member of the Society in order not to miss any of our events further on. So again, very warm welcome, and I'm really glad to welcome you tonight, Arturo, and let me briefly introduce you to the audience, even though I'm sure that everyone is very familiar with Arturo Escobar's work. So Arturo Escobar is professor for anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His academic research interests are very broad, and amongst other topics, they focus on political ecology, anthropology of development, social movements, anti-globalization movements, political ontology, and post-development theory. Arturo has taught at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, but also abroad at institutions in Colombia, Finland, Spain, England, and many other places of the world. Escobar's path into anthropology, however, has been a rather unique one, and maybe this also contributed to the originality of his work. So he started studying chemical engineering and biochemistry at the Universidad de Valle in Cali, in Colombia, and he also a master's degree in food sciences from Cornell University in the US. Over time, however, Escobar has increasingly turned his attention to questions of development theory and policy, earning his PhD in development philosophy, policy, and planning from the University of California at Berkeley. Arturo Escobar is one of the harshest critics of development. He recognizes a continuation of colonial thinking in the concept of development, and today is one of the leading representatives of post-development approach. Representatives of this approach seek alternatives to development in grassroots movements and local knowledge. In his latest books, he has fostered the idea of the pluriverse as a world in which many worlds fit. Thus, his book from 2020, Pluriversal Politics, the Real and the Possible, and the book from 2018, Designs for the Pluriverse, Radical Interdependence, Autonomy, and the Making of Worlds, both published with Duke University Press. Your lecture, Arturo, tonight is entitled Relationality, Pluriversality, and Care as Foundations of Ecosocial Transitions. Glad to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Niels, for the invitation. We've been talking about my coming to Tübingen with Niels and before with other people that I'll mention in a moment for a few years, and it hasn't materialized yet for different reasons, chiefly my own health that places limitation on travel. But I'm glad to be here, at least virtually. I've been in contact over the years and giving some talks with other people at Tübingen, Esteban Moreira, who's here, Professor Sebastian Thiels, and more recently, Professor Ricarda Flemmer, who also translated or organized a translation of a collective work in which I was involved, which was called Pluriverse, a Post-Development Dictionary. So that is in German, also already came out just a few months ago. So my thanks to all of them. My thanks to all of you for being here today. I will speak for about 50 minutes at the most, so that we have half an hour of conversation. And I'm going to share the screen with the PowerPoint. I must say that I usually with the PowerPoint, I don't say what is there. I talked around the images and the text that are there, but I will be pleased to send it to, in fact, I will send it to Liz, to Niels, so you can have it if any of you is interested in that. Okay, so let me share the screen, and hopefully this will work well. Let me see, can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it very well.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Let me put it in the presentation mode. Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
So yes, I'm going to be talking about these three different or four different concepts actually. Relationality or interdependence, pluriversality, a world that is made of many different worlds, not just made of a single dominant way of thinking about the world and constructing the world, and care as a foundational ethics and practice for socio-ecological transitions, civilizational transitions, or what have you. And I want to start with this image, which is the logo of our current transition design project in Colombia, Un río Cauca muchos mundos, one Cauca river, many worlds, transitando la paz territorial pluriversal, transitioning towards territorial pluriversal peace. This is a collective project, mostly with Afro-Colombian organizations and communities, feminist activists, Black activists, environmental activists, to reimagine our region, which is around the city of Cali, in case of you, some of you have been there, from a region that has been really devastated by 100 years of a development model based on sugarcane monoculture, extensive cattle ranching, and agro-industrial development, to a very different region that we can imagine and that we are trying to begin the process of bringing about that dream. So I'll tell you a little bit about the project. Not too much today. It's not the topic of the lecture, but I will tell you a little bit about it as we move along. So a bit of the summary of the argument. We start with the concept of terricide, terricidio, proposed by the movement for the South American movement of women and indigenous women and diversities for Buen Vivir, is the killing of the earth. And I think this image from the Zapatista art summarizes well terricidio. You don't see it well probably on your screens, but the figure of the death is Monsanto, actually, the great multinational company injecting its poisons and for monocultures, and the resisting communities of indigenous communities in Chiapas resisting that terricide, keeping their work and their cosmovision in place, cultivating and growing and making communities in a different way. Then we talk a little bit about relationality and care as foundations for thinking about life, the human, and world-making practices that are very different from the ones that are based on separation and the lack of care that we have predominant today. We'll explain that. And then this is going to be the main part of my intervention, which is that one of the main arguments that I'm going to make here is that we are in dire need of transitioning between stories of life, between narratives of life, from a narrative, the Judeo-Christian narrative of separation and anthropocentrism and rationality and instrumentality and so forth, to a narrative of interdependence and care, and that we're seeing that these new narratives are emerging in many different parts of the world, actually in Europe, everywhere, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in many parts of the world. We see with greater or lesser clarity that what is going on in many ways as well is a struggle over the coming up with different narratives of life, different ways of understanding the human and the earth. So we'll talk a little bit about some issues in ontological politics of transitions. I'll explain what that means. And finally, a few remarks on design, which is what I've been working on, especially in the past decade, designing from and for relationality and care, which is very different from the kind of designing that goes on in design schools. Okay, So quote from ground, the earth is literally on fire. We know that, literally, figuratively, in so many different ways. It's worth repeating this sentence from Gramsci. It's very well known that the crisis is consistent in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born yet. And the second part is what is most interesting for me. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. So we see the morbid symptoms everywhere. The genocide in Gaza is the most impactful and clear example of that. The war in Ukraine, the utter inability of the economic and political elite of the world to act on climate change, to choose life over death. They continue to keep choosing death over life. And we find expressions of that very same idea in many different sources, in many, many different sources. I was impacted by this one that I found from a wonderful Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, who invites us to meditate actively on the passing of the Western civilizational project. Of course, from the Buddhist principle of impermanence of things applied to civilizations, even this project, the project of modern liberal secular humanism, is going to pass and needs to pass, at least in its current form, or needs to be reinvented significantly. So we have a different way of thinking about crisis and transitions, highlights the civilizational dimensions. Indigenous peoples in Latin America have been talking about a civilizational crisis for at least since 1992. And this goes along very well with the emphasis in contemporary social theory on developing ontological perspectives, that is, perspectives that go beyond epistemology, beyond concern with knowledge, to the concern with actual ways of being, actual ways of creating reality and the real with world making as we know it. So very important again, and this goes a lot for us working on the planetary crisis, the importance of relocating again the human within a living earth and a living cosmos. The fact that we are inhabitants and creatures of a living earth and a living cosmos, and we have lost the perspective on that. Indigenous peoples keep reminding us of that all the time. And so to talk a little bit about the concept of Terricide, which again proposed by indigenous women in South America. And what is interesting about Terricide is that it doesn't include only the killing of the physical ecosystems, but the killing of the spiritual ecosystems, the killing of the knowledges, beliefs, feelings, spiritual life of all peoples, and not only of indigenous peoples, but especially of indigenous peoples, so that we have to, what they are calling on us, to build different civilizational metrics that embraces buen vivir as a right, and buen vivir is an idea, a Latin American idea, of a collective well-being, a well-being for all, and what that means. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move along as well. Another way of thinking about the crisis, where are we today? What is the current conjuncture? And it's very important to think about that question. So one way to see it is that we are in between the world that we have designed. I love this Escher drawing because it shows very well that we exist within the world that is of our design, but that world is designing us back. Design designs, as Anne-Marie Willis, the Australian design theorist, puts it. We design the world and the world designs us back. And these designs are destroying us. So we are again between the design world and the earth, the unbroken wholeness that physicist David Bond talks about, the continuum of life that is always of matter and energy, that is always producing forms and everything else, the topoietic capacity of the earth for self-creation, the continuous self-creation of the earth, and that might be creating this space that we can call planetary locality. And I emphasize the locality because the planetary touches upon a place everywhere. Everywhere the planetary is local. It has global dynamics, but everywhere the planetary condition is local. And that this is the space for new relational thinking and for new designing praxis. And finally, this is the other way in which it's great to think about crisis. This comes from the work of Thomas Berry, a wonderful North American ecologist and theologian who passed away about 25 years ago. And this sentence again calls on us to consider actively the stories that we narrate as our stories and how they are not working anymore. He says, we are in trouble just now because we do not have a good story. We are in between stories. The old story, the anthropocentric story of mastering and control of the earth, has become a dysfunctional cosmology. It is no longer the story of the earth, nor is it the integral story of the human community. It is a sectarian story. So we know the landmarks of this story, colonialism, capitalism, the so-called discovery of America, the conquest of America, development, slavery, enslavement of African peoples, the goddess of progress, colonization, technology, and so forth. So it's a story that is anchored, that is enacted in a whole series of practices and narratives and beliefs that are very persistent, that are very old and long-standing. This is the face of Terricide, the huge plantations of oil palm planted in so many parts of the global south, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, or in my own region of Colombia, sugarcane plantation. I was referring to it around the city of Cali. It's all planted with cane. And as Wendy Wolford, the geographer, says, a lot of our current system has to do with the plantation as a social system from the 16th century on, in the Americans in particular. So, and I like the way in which the Chinese philosopher Yu Hui, some of you might have read some of his work already. He's really doing a wonderful work with his understanding technology in a different way. He says, how should we respond to the challenge the human has undertaken to eliminate its own condition of existence? So we are killing our conditions of existence, and not only of the humans, of the non-human living world as well, and of the planet at large. So in the last instance, it has to do with the stories about the human. Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter and Brazilian Amazonian indigenous intellectual Ailton Krenak said it so clearly. Wynter talks about how we are contained or stuck with this idea of the human that started to emerge in the 16th century in Europe, and with the scientific revolution, and then the Darwinian revolution, and then the economics, the modern economics of capitalism, the human as, in quote, naturally competitive, secular, liberal, rational, and so forth. So the human is that, but it's not naturally that. The human is also naturally cooperative and caring and so forth. And that's the other part of the narrative of the human that we have to start cultivating today, moving towards a new ontology of the human. And there won't be one single way to start that project. There's many new narratives, multiple beginnings, in everywhere people are trying to do in all parts of the world that deviate from the standard way of doing things with greater or greater degree of clarity and success. So if we need a new narrative of life, where are we going to anchor that narrative? What is that narrative about? And here we find the first of our concepts, relationality, or radical interdependence. So relationality is a way of understanding reality that suggests that everything is interdependent, that everything is mutually constituted. It's not that we're just connected. It's not just about connection. It's about interdependence and mutual constitution. I exist because everything else exists, like in the principle of Ubuntu. I am because you are. That we are not just these human bodies, we are earth beings. We are connected to water, to mountains, to territories. Beyond that narrative of separation, the separation between humans and the earth, between mind and body, between us and them. And this sentence by Martin Luther King really puts it so well when he says, all life is interrelated and we are tied up in a network of mutuality, in a single garment of destiny. This is the interrelated structure of reality. So the foundation, the essence of reality is interdependence. It's not separation, as we think about in modern worlds. It's not the dualism of modernity. It's a radical ontology of relationality. A little bit more on relationality. This is from a book that we published recently with two dear friends, Mihalos Terwar and Kruti Sharma, on the concept of relationality. So to some extent, it's a new concept, but it's also a concept that is just re-emerging because it's always been there in the history of the West, before dualism became the dominant ontology among indigenous peoples worldwide in many different parts of the world. And Ubuntu, soy porque somos, is a good explanation of that principle of interdependence. And this is Francia Marquez in the picture, the current Colombian vice president, who ran her campaign on the slogan of Ubuntu slogan, soy porque somos, I am because you are. And the implication of that is that we want to transition between stories, from the story of separation to the story of relationality, of independence. We need to become aware of the defining character of narratives. As Sylvia Winter puts it, that we are homo narrans, we are a self-narrating humanity, and that we need to change our narratives, our foundational narratives, if we want to shift from the project of death to the project of life. So in our book, Relationality, we're interested in what does it mean to recenter politics on making life in a different way. Instead of outsourcing life, the making of life to corporations and the state and so forth, we call that the political activation of relationality. And what we see, if we look at territorial struggles in many different parts of the world, is precisely that relationality is being activated politically and in many different ways. Second concept is care. And those of you who have worked with the feminist concept of care know much more about this than me, I'm sure. The feminist contributions on political economy, political ecology have been essential, about social reproduction, about value change, about the amazing work that women in particular, but also immigrants, people of color do to care for others and the planet. And it is really the ethics of many indigenous peoples is to care for each other and the territory. And there is always a political question. So the conception of care is a very deep anti-patriarchal, decolonizing, querying perspective on care. Care is not essential. Care is historical, and we need to depatriarchalize care and decolonize care. Care is connected to questions about justice. It's connected to, obviously, to capitalism. And Wendy Harcourt and her group at the ISS in The Hague, in particular, have been thinking about caring communities for radical change in their work. They're continuing working on care, which is very interesting and inspiring. There is a lot to think about how do we rethink economics from the perspective of care. Economics doesn't have a single idea about how to care for the earth. And then again, highlighting decolonizing care. And I'm just going to talk about the first issue, which is that we really live in modern patriarchal capitalist societies that have been anti-care, or that can only care superficially. The designers Ezio Mancini and Virginia Tassinari talk about the paradox that we live in societies of services, care services, that are also careless societies. We have health services, education services, housing services, and so forth, but they are not really about care. They are highly hierarchical, institutionalized, expert-based, which is leading to the feminization and precarization of care. So we need different ways of thinking about care and constructing infrastructures for care. Okay, now we start the sort of the most newer part maybe of the talk. Some of you might have heard me talk a little bit about this before. I've been working on this for a couple of years. And it is, if we look at the world today, where do we see that there are emerging those new or different narratives of life? And one of the places that I've been looking at, just because I happen to be from there, but also because I see them very clearly there, is in Latin America. And especially at that interface between social struggles, social movements, and critical social theory in the academy. And is a project of the process through which feminist, Black, indigenous environmental movements are particularly contributing. It is something that comes out of a different epistemology that links mind and body, sentir pensar, to feel, think, corazonar, to think with the heart as well, and very, very much centered on revealing interdependence and thinking about the unthinkable. And this is a hypothesis that I'm trying to develop, is that we have a new narrative that is anchored on a tapestry, an entanglement of concepts, and which are the 6 concepts that you see here. I'm going to explain each of them in a moment. Territoriality, communality, autonomy, pluriversality, transition, and buen vivir, re-existence, and the last one, which in many ways brings all of them together, is a politics in the feminine. So this is the kind of narrative that is emerging, that enables us to move from Terricide to buen vivir. In Europe, you talk about degrowth. Some people talk about degrowth. In the southwest of the US, there's a group, wonderful group, talk about deceleration, deceleration. In our project, we found the narrative of life emerging from the alternatives in the community level with which we're working, and they take the form of many different idioms, many different words and concepts, certain about transitions and about designing with the dreams and about relationality, but also about weaving, about restoring, about de-racializing, about de-patriarchalizing, and so forth. The second concept that I want to explain before I move on to explain each one of the 6 categories is the concept of how these narratives do not exist in isolation. They are completely entangled with other narratives, and especially with the dominant narrative. And this is very schematic and in some ways simplistic, but I think, bear with me for now. And if we put the dominant narrative in red together with the emergent narrative in blue, the dominant narrative, the story of man, the anthropocentric story, the story of masculinism and global capitalism centered on the individual, scarcity, one truth, state, and so forth. We see obviously that this dominant story has been impacting upon any other possible stories for a long time, forever, but that the emergent stories are beginning to make some inroads into the dominant story. And at the interface of these narratives, we find a very interesting zone that with Marisol de la Cadena, a dear friend and colleague, anthropology colleague from Peru, we call pluriversal contact zones. And we see these pluriversal contact zones at play, especially in environmental conflicts, which are really ontological conflicts also. Conflicts over rivers, forests, mountains, commons. To give you an example, the conflicts over rivers, local communities defend in the Pacific region of Colombia, for instance, local Black communities were pushing the state to declare the main river of the region, the Atrato River, as a subject of rights, which they were able to succeed in doing that in 2016, I'm sorry. But the struggle was very interesting because for the Black communities of the forest and the river, what they emphasized was the inseparability between the humans and the river and the forest. The fact that they do not exist outside of or without the river, that they are the river and they are the forest. So for the state, that's nonsense. For the state, the river is H2O. Maybe it's an ecosystem. It's a source of livelihood because the people fish in them. So they couldn't really understand the language of the communities But in the process that took a number of years and continues today, something happened. An epistemic negotiation, an ontological negotiation happened, and they were able to converge around the figure of the rise of the river, which is not exactly what the communities wanted, but it's something that allows the communities to go on defending the river, and it's something that pushed the state to move from its traditional stand in which rights apply only to humans, to begin to shift towards the rights of nature movement, really, in which rights also apply to the non-living human beings. So we're paying attention to these pluriversal contact zones now, especially, and you can see them everywhere in the world where there is an environmental conflict. I know there are many in Europe around rivers now, and many attempts by local groups to defend rivers to some extent on the grounds that they are also living beings. Okay, so that was quick. I'm going to skip over this to just begin with a very brief, this is a super brief, sorry about that, explanation of these concepts. The concept of territoriality. It makes a lot of sense. We live our lives in territories. In cities, we don't see it that way. Urban life is very deterritorialized. But if we're not in cities, we know that we live in territories, territories of life, as many people call it today. And especially, we realize this inseparability between humans and the territory. That speaks also to the sacred dimension of life and territoriality. And there is a feminist concept from Latin America today, the concept of cuerpos territorios, and body territory, the body territory, that speaks about the continuity between the body and the territory, not only because women are engaged in the struggle over the territories and they often lead those struggles, but also because they are connected, deeply connected with territories, as we are with the earth, even if we don't see it in that way, again, in our city cubicles in the cities. And this is really non-liberal. It does away with the notion of the liberal individual that is separate and autonomous. It's a depatriarchalized notion because it is also focused on how the destruction of the territories and the violence against women's bodies is one and the same. And so we can talk about these non-liberal territorialities that are emerging in many different parts of the world. The second is the concept of communality, and it goes along with the first. We are the comunalidad. The concept was coined by indigenous intellectuals in Oaxaca in the 1970s. And comunalidad speaks about the inevitable communal dimension of all existence. We are also communal beings, the co-emergence of humans and the worlds. And the implication that we have to think, and we do think and make relationally, nosotricamente, comunalicraticamente, communalocracy, that's a difficult word in English, because it is the communal that binds humans to place. And so the political implication is that the communitarian popular horizon arises as the clue or the guidelines that we have for reweaving our communities, the real existing communities with all their tensions and their power relations and the good, bad, and ugly sides to them, but that we have to begin the process of recommunalization and reweaving our communities, especially in the territories. Okay. The third principle is the principle of autonomy. This is a very Latin American concept. The Zapatistas of Chiapas have been one of the greatest theorizers of and makers of local autonomies. And it talks about a politics based on sufficiency, mutuality, conviviality, and self-determination. And we can link it to modern ideas about distributed democracy and about self-government. It's also a way to refocus the economy on meeting social needs and livelihoods more autonomously, again, not depending so much on corporations and the state, and to relocalize what's possible to relocalize, especially food. Food is one of the most important things that many social movements and organized groups in Latin America today emphasize that needs to be relocalized, because the key to autonomy in many ways is food sovereignty. Without food, you cannot be autonomous. Without autonomy, you cannot defend the territory, you cannot defend community. So this is from the Cauca region in Colombia, where there's a very intense indigenous struggle since the time of the conquest, really, but intensified in the past 3 or 4 decades to resist the displacement of the indigenous communities and to recuperate the territories and lands. So in that sense, we see that pluriversality is the dance between autonomy and interdependence. Some people say, well, yeah, but autonomy is about separation. No, it's not about separation. Nobody is emphasizing autonomy to become separate, but to becoming interdependent and to relate in a different way from a position of strength and not from a position of weakness. Pre-existence, another Latin American concept that talks about how, especially in the context of Afro-descendant communities in Colombia and Ecuador in particular, talking about how the people who were enslaved, when they were freed or when they fled, they didn't only resist, they had to create dignified forms of existence. They have to re-exist in the territories. So in a way, re-existence is a kind of ontological resilience, a resilience that says that what they have been doing is precisely to defend their world-making practices, their cosmovisions, their ways of seeing the world, especially to remain while changing, as the slogan goes, based on their ancestrality, but always orienting themselves toward a future from their own perspective. Concepts of resurgence and regeneration are also related to re-existence. Pluriversality, I already mentioned, the Zapatista defined it in the most succinct way: a world where many worlds fit, a world of many worlds. To the right, we see the book Pluriverse, a Post-Development Dictionary that I mentioned. It has many ideas about many local ways of conceiving of the pluriverse. I should have placed the cover of the German edition here. I just didn't think about it before, but it is there for you, those of you who are interested. Okay. And so transitions are transitions that have to be based on moving beyond global extractivism. The model of global extractivism has to foster food sovereignty, energy transitions, rights of nature, and so forth. And of course, this exists in the context of the struggle between the system of power at the top. And if we have time, we can talk about that in the conversation. What is the system of power today that has been emerging and that is so deadly and so controlling in the world today? And the struggles of communities on the ground. And finally, politics in the feminine, a very important concept proposed originally by Mexican sociologist Raquel Gutierrez Aguilar, very interesting and thoughtful activist and academic, that suggests that it starts also with a slogan in Latin American feminisms that there is no decolonization without depatriarchalization, that the two of them have to go together. De-racialization, decolonization, and depatriarchalization belong in the same movement. And that politics in the feminine speaks about the reappropriation of the collective production of life, especially from the perspective of care. Again, so it's about the politics in the feminism, it's about an ethics and practice of care for the relations in which we are placed, in which we are woven, taking it away from masculinist capitalist practices that destroy life, for the protection of life, for a life-centered politics. It's a politics in the feminine that brings together relationality, communality, and autonomy at the service of the earth And that, with Rita Segato, a wonderful feminist, Argentinian feminist anthropologist, will help us in the transition from the historical project of things to the historical project of relations, or relationality, or interdependence. And I always like this quote from Rita, which could be very controversial, but she says, to opt for the relational path, for the path of interdependence and communality, is to choose the historical project of being community, opposing the productivist, developmentalist, and exploitative project of things. The strategy from now on is feminine. This is not an essentialist statement that the feminine is just because the feminine is good. No, it's not that. It's a profoundly anti-essentialist, anti-patriarchal, and depatriarchalized concept. One quick warning about, I'm not going to talk about this because that's a huge subject. I'm working on this also, which is how new technologies, especially artificial intelligence, is changing everything we do. And a lot of people talk about today about the revolution of AI. And that revolution of AI has to be met with a revolution of care. And we always have to ask the question that who is doing the cultural political work of imagining the future? And we have to admit that it is the techno-patriarchal gurus of AI and new technologies that are gaining the upper hand in giving us the most powerful images about the future. And these are very patriarchal, capitalistic images of the future. So the question becomes, and this is a question being asked by people like Dilnot, designer at the New School, and again, Yuk Hui, the Chinese philosopher, and many other people, mostly from post-Heideggerian perspectives, but also by people like Safiya Novel, who talks about algorithms of oppression, and Yanis Varoufakis in his last book, one of his last books, I don't know if the last one, called Techno-Feudalism, What Killed Capitalism, when he talks about that we are all becoming feudal serfs of this new system based on cloud capital, and we are losing more and more autonomy. So we have this amazingly powerful elite with power over life and death, and which are transforming life and the earth and the planet on the very with their algorithms, and the algorithms embody and incorporate within themselves this very patriarchal, capitalistic, dualistic cosmovision of control and appropriation, and ultimately violence and war. So that we have to be keeping a lot of attention to this question. And last section, if this is going to be brief. So how do we think about the politics of transitioning between narratives? And here I think we have to deal with two open questions in both social theory and in activist practice as well. And the two questions are the following. The first one is, what is significant social change? What is radical social change? What we used to call systemic change. If we do not accept anymore the answer to that question from either liberalism, which was never adequate anyways, nor traditional Marxism, then what is radical social change? And we really don't have good answers to that question anymore. So there's a lot of soul searching around that in both activist practice and social theory. And the second, which is really an entry into the first one, is what is a transformative alternative? Even a very small one. How do we know when we're doing something that is really moving beyond the current way of doing things in a significant way? That is going beyond the system of domination in which we're all entrapped today. And there are quite a few groups. There are already at least a few, I know about 5 or 6 groups that are focusing on those two questions. One of them that I'm most acquainted with because I'm being part of it is the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, Global Tapestry of Alternatives. You will find it easily on the internet. This is the last publication, which is was coordinated by Tristi I can't remember now Tristi's last name, Bakpai and Vasna Ramasar, two wonderful colleagues originally from India. Vasna is actually at Lund University, and it's precisely the question of what is a radical alternative. And as we have developed that idea over the 4 or 5 years in which the GTA has been in existence, and how can we think about the convergence among those transformative alternatives? And then before I show you this, and there is a lot of thinking about that in terms of networks and meshworks and rhizomes of transformative alternatives, but especially the question is, how do we foster the convergences among these oftentimes small alternatives that are emerging in so many different parts of the world, all over the world, really. And in our own project in Colombia, sorry, the thrust of our project precisely centered on that question: how do we foster convergences among the between 15 and 20 relatively small transformative alternatives that the groups themselves that make up the project have identified for themselves, and trying to connect them with each other and try to create conditions by which a self-reinforcing process takes place in the context of really difficult conditions that includes the armed conflict, narco-trafficking, extractivism, and so forth. I'm going to skip over that. Going back to the question of the politics in the feminine, and again, is this is just a local politics? And it's not. And this is the argument that a group in Puebla, Mexico, that includes Raquel Gutierrez Aguilar also, Lucia Linsalata, Mina Lorena Navarro, and others, mostly feminist activists and academics, argue that these local struggles have an expansive potential and a capacity for rupture. They are plural, they are concrete, they are localized, but they are also generalizable. If we think from the practice, they disperse the power of the state, and especially the concept of scale. How do we go beyond the conventional notion of scale that privileges the global? And how do we move towards a conception of scale that is more horizontal, that privilege local relational life and the relational politics at the local level, but again, imagining rhizomatic expansion, as Astrid Ulloa in Colombia and Lucía Lenslata in Mexico, for instance, have been thinking about that question. And finally, brief conclusion, to tell you a little about the design angle of this, starting with this wonderful quote from Moira Millán. Moira Millán is a Mapuche, incredible activist, intellectual, author, writer, author of this book, Terricidio. It's going to come out in English, in French, and in Spanish very soon. She's author of 2 different books before, novels. And she says, we need to create a revolution in thinking, a revolution of thought, identitarian and telluric. I won't explain that part for now, but especially the second part, el despertar de los hacedores y hacedoras de una nueva matriz civilizatoria. The consciousness, the awakening of the makers of a new civilizational matrix. So it's about making, it's about constructing, not just about imagining a different civilizational matrix, but making it happen, again, making it happen through transformative alternatives at the local level, at the regional level, at the territorial level, and connecting up with each other. Okay, so some designing implications. It's about making life otherwise. Can design be in support of the world-making practices and local struggles? And this is a shift in designing, of course, from designing as usual to a relational kind of designing and pluriversal kind of designing the pluriversal contact zones as portals to relational worlds, involving actors that have interests in common that are not the same interests. In the example that I gave, the Black communities of the Pacific rainforest have some interest and that they were not the same interest of the state, but they did have a common interest at the same time. And a political imagination that fosters the encounter between different ways of making the world, of thinking about the world, different ontologies. That's from de la Cadena and Blaser, from a book called A World of Many Worlds. And finally, and this is the last slide, beginning with this idea from Bayo Komolafe, it's a wonderfully creative Nigerian psychologist, curator of the Emergence Network. The way isn't forward, it is awkward. It is awkward like in many different kinds of directions. Is it awkward as in not privileged in one single direction, especially directions that reintroduce verticality and separation and hierarchies? Going beyond solutionism, engaging, embracing uncertainty, contingency, and anticipation, an ontology of drift, which is the evolutionary ontology. Ontology is the drift of history, of co-emergence and care, recognizing that we're all designers and we're all design, and we need to start the redesigning task anytime and anywhere. And this definition of design, that's a mindful and effective praxis of weaving and repairing the web of life, especially from interdependence and care. Designing as mobilizing for new ways of dwelling on the earth. Reinvent possibility. Another possible is possible. We need to think about the possible otherwise. And there's an emergent field and new journal. The first issue of this journal came out a few months ago, called Possibility Studies. Okay, so I will stop here. I think that's about 50 minutes, as I mentioned, maybe a little bit